Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this conversation with Vivimarie VanderPoorten, award-winning Sri Lankan poet and educationalist. Before we begin, I would like to ask the audience, would you please put any questions that you have for Vivi in the chat as we go through our conversation, and then towards the end there will be an opportunity for those questions to be posed to Vivi and for you to hear her answers. Could I also remind everyone that we will be recording this session so that it can be accessed by those who were not able to join us live this afternoon. Thank you very much. So I'm going to just start with a couple of words about myself. I'm Gill Caldicott. I'm the director of the British Council here in Sri Lanka. And I'm also rather passionate about literature and about books in general. So I feel very honoured to be in conversation today with an award-winning poet. And so at this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Vivimarie VanderPoorten. Vivimarie is a senior lecturer in English language, literature and linguistics at the Department of Language Studies at the Open University here in Sri Lanka. She obtained her bachelor's from the University of Kelaniya and an MA and a PhD from the University of Ulster, which is a very interesting choice, and I'm going to ask her a little bit about that. Her areas of interest that she has generally stated include bilingual education, second language acquisition, gender and discourse, sociolinguistics, and Sri Lankan English. And she is, of course, and this is why we're talking to her today particularly, she's an award-winning poet, as you're aware, and her book, Nothing Prepares You, won the Gratian Prize in 2007. And she was also awarded the 2009 SARC Poetry Award in Delhi. Her second publication, Stitch Your Eyelids Shut, jointly won the State Literary Award in 2011. And she's also published a third volume of poetry, Borrowed Dust, which was shortlisted for the 2016 Gratian Prize. And in addition to that, she's known overseas. Her work has been translated into a number of languages. So at home here, into Sinhala, but also into Spanish, into Swedish, and more recently into Nepalese, I understand. So let us turn to Vivi. Vivi, welcome so much for joining us here in this conversation this afternoon. It's a great honour.
Thank you very much, and I'm very honoured to be here.
Great. So I would like, I hope you feel comfortable with me calling you Vivi, and I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit more about your background and the various influences on you. So I sort of noticed in my readings of all your work that your poetry ranges across a whole spectrum, from war to gender to love and grief, of course, and even race, a very topical subject as it is right now. And I think you have said that your poetry is quite political with a small p, both political and personal. And could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay, you first asked me my influences. So my influences were made mostly, I think, the society I grew up in. So that's why you can find a lot about war and conflict in my work. There's a lot about death. So basically my life's experiences, a lot of my life's experiences are in my first book. So I was influenced by what happened to me, what happened to people around me, and to our country in general. So that would be my influences. Yeah, nothing prepares you. My background, well, I grew up in Kurunegala, which is a city about 96 kilometers away from Colombo. and then I came to Colombo when I was 19, and I've lived here ever since. And I've been abroad only for studies and conferences and workshops, but I grew up and have lived entirely almost in Sri Lanka. Uh, and yeah, so that did I miss anything?
Yeah, a very difficult time that Sri Lanka was going through in the time that you were
Yeah,
growing up. And I can
yeah,
see that a lot of that has come through in your poetry. Um, Now, I know that you very kindly agreed to read some poetry for us, and I wonder if this is perhaps an appropriate moment to ask you to read one or two of your poems that touch on that period, on the war and on conflict and the problem of violence and the scars that it leaves.
okay, yes, I'll read. Um,
Thank you.
Another thing about political with a small p, just I would like to go back to that. Um,
Mm.
I think a lot of my work is very overtly political with an uppercase P as well.
Oh,
And I
okay.
but I think that I think I share the feminist perspective that the personal is the political as well. So yeah, that's just to go back to that. I'm
Yeah,
going
no,
to read a, sorry.
that
I'm going to read a poem which is one of my favorites from my own book. It's called Disappearance, and it was inspired by um, the youth insurrection of 89, 87, 89. At the time, I was, just leaving school. So I'm going to read that poem called Disappearance. It's about a lot of things, including the young men who went missing during that JVP insurrection. Disappearance. From our study hall in the hostel, we had watched the Crow couple build their rudimentary house between two gutters and a pipe, PVC and aluminum, replacing branch and bark, marveling at the bird's ability to adapt to life in the big city. One night, two polecats, black, bushy-tailed, arrived stealthily, snatched the baby crow out of its shabby nest while his mother was away. There was a brief moment of squawking and then silence. I remember that night well. There was a power cut in the capital and a curfew in force. The crow returned later that night and called out to her lost one until dawn. I stood on the balcony watching helplessly. She tilted her glossy head at me, and, and her black eyes bore into mine, asking pleadingly, "Did you see? Did you see? Did you see? Did you see? Did you see who took him away?" Cawing accusingly, "Do you not? Did you not? Did you not? Did you not even try to stop them?" Um, so that one is about um, the accountability of us who watched. That was the poem that I wrote for that. Um, I will read another
yeah,
one.
that's
Yeah,
That's
go.
very interesting. You know, all the discussions that are going on at the moment about we can no longer afford to be bystanders. And
Yes,
that's very much what I heard coming out in your poem there. You know, that's,
yes. Um,
sorry, your second one, yes.
yes. Um, this one is also a poem from that era. Obviously, it had such a really big impact on me, and I call it Unsound. Before he started hearing his dead sister's voice, he used to hang out with friends, wheel his bicycle along the bund of the village tank, look at girls out of the corner of his eye, sometimes do Shramadana at the local orphanage. before he started hearing strange sounds, seeing devils attacking him. He used to study political science and dream about being a teacher before the interrogation. Now he sits in a ward for the mentally ill and stares endlessly at a bulb shaped like a teardrop. People in human rights wrote about men like him in important journals. But now many years have passed, and back in the village, he is simply known as Iskole Mahatyage Pissukolla, which means the village school teacher's crazy son. Um,
Yeah, the scars that violence and war leaves. That's very moving. Thank you.
um,
One more,
should
or shall we move on to another area?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, we
Okay,
can move on.
okay. I'm sort of very fascinated by the fact that you actually went to Belfast in Northern Ireland,
Right,
which, of course, for me with my British background is, the memories that I have of Ireland is one of war and terrorism. So some parallels there with what's happened, I think, in Sri Lanka.
right.
And I know that you were there at around the year 2000 when, and you've gone for your master's and your PhD. But that was all around about the time of the Good Friday Agreement in
That's right.
Ireland,
Yeah.
when peace broke out, so to speak. And I just wondered if you'd tell us a little bit about why you went to Belfast and, what were the influences on you there and what sort of impact did your time there have on you?
Okay. To be very precise, my university was in a small town called Coleraine,
Mm-hmm.
which was a little off Belfast, yeah. But the university itself had campuses in Belfast as well.
Uh-huh.
But my
Right.
campus was in Coleraine. But yeah, I've been to Belfast and to Derry, and it's sometimes called London Derry, but then mostly people there call it Derry. So I've traveled around there. The reason I went actually was quite random. It was a World Bank scholarship uh, that uh, got me there for my masters. It was an agreement between the UNESCO and our Ministry of Higher Education or Ministry of Education, and they were giving scholarships to teacher educators so that we could learn something from like a newly post-conflict society. So
Interesting.
Northern Ireland at that time was just newly post-conflict, and it was considered a contested society, right? So that was how University of Ulster came into my life, or rather, I went into the Northern Ireland. Um, and when I went there, we got to see a lot of integrated schools, how educational institutions were working towards peace building and education for social cohesion. Um, so yeah, and we saw many parallels, but also a lot of differences um, in the conflict, in the type of conflict, in the history of the conflict. So yeah, that's how I went there. But when it came to my PhD, I had a choice because I got an Asian Development Bank scholarship to the PhD, but um, the funding was not a lot. It was quite limited. So I applied to many universities, but and though I was accepted, I wasn't able to afford the fees. And because I had a previous link with the University of Ulster, they agreed to have me as a PhD student, and I also loved the place. I knew the place, and I thought, why not go back to somewhere I've already been? And I felt like I'd been before. It gave me a kind of a sort of deja vu in a good way. It felt like
Yes.
home in many ways. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, I'd like to pick up on what you just said about divided communities and what you can learn about how education can influence social cohesion, which I think is Lanka as well. I wanted to ask you, do you think that Sri Lanka is moving successfully along that path to social cohesion? And do you think that in your education role at teach training and so on at the university, the Open University, that you're able to influence that through your teaching?
Right. I'll answer the second question first. Um, well, we
Okay.
all try, and that is very much in our awareness, especially when you teach something like social linguistics, or which is about language and its interaction with society and power, and also literature, of course. Um, I hope that we are able to influence our students. A lot of them are adults, and they are non-traditional students who are they are mature students. So in many ways, their values and all are already in place when they come. But having said that, I think we learn a lot from each other. I learn from my students as well, and we try to discuss things like diversity and the celebration of difference and the whole idea that different but equal. Yeah, so I think to some extent, I like to think that we are successful in building social cohesion in educational institutes. The first question about are we on the way? I think we definitely are making progress, but especially at like a grassroots level and among the people and communities. Um, I I think I'll reserve my comments about higher authorities and the uh, their aspiration for social cohesion. I think that there's a lot of it there, but well, a lot needs to be done still. But 10 years after the war, 9 years after the war, I think we are not close enough to the goal, but I like to think that we are somewhere there on that path, heading in the right direction, hopefully.
Yes, I hope so too. But of course, it's true in every society. I mean, we've seen in Britain, how just divided views or divided political opinions can
Yeah.
show up, that we are not very, socially cohesive either. So I think this is a very difficult time worldwide, actually, isn't it, in terms of division? Okay, the next question is a little bit personal, but I'm very, very intrigued by the dedication in your award-winning poetry, and Nothing Prepares You, to your father. And I could sort of feel that he must have been very important to you in your life. And the dedication is quite enigmatic. If I can just read it, it says, "For sound and unsound shared." And I wondered if you'd be prepared to say a little bit more about that, and also just how personal grief has impacted on your poetry.
Right. So I was very close to my father. Uh, I always felt like we were more like friends. He was also quite a young father. Um, I was born when he was still in his 20s. So yeah, I was really close to him, and then he died very suddenly. He was not yet 60 when he died. So a lot of my poetry was written during that period of grief, the period when he was very ill. He was ill just for 3 months, and then he passed away, and I took care of him. And a lot of poetry comes out from that, the pain of watching somebody that you love dying and not being able to do anything about it. Uh, so yeah, and he influenced me in many ways in terms of one thing that comes to my mind is he always taught me to try and be brave. He always said that you need to be brave. So I think I felt that writing this book also was in some ways an act of small bravery. um, because to write and put something out there, especially some things that are personal, requires courage. So I thought
Yes.
I should dedicate it to him. Yeah, and he loved silence. That's why. So I'm punning on the word unsound because he loved to listen to the birds and just listen to the silence. And I pun on unsound because some of the craziest times that we went through in our country, I shared that experience with him. So that's hence the dedication.
That's really lovely. And I wonder if I could ask you to perhaps choose a poem and give us another reading at this point.
Yes. Okay. So I'll read one that I wrote for my father. Um, this is one that I wrote about a week after he passed away. I call it Brown Death. Brown, the earthworms you made me hold in excited little fingers when I was 5. Brown, the leaves you heaped up and burnt in the backyard on hot August days. Brown, the smell of the first rain on parched earth, smells and sights we loved, you and I. Brown, the urn they put your ashes in. Brown, the river we scattered them on. Brown, the pots you planted red flowers in and gave me to take away. Only days before, the world went crazy and you went away. Um,
That was lovely.
I like to read
Do you have
one.
another?
Yes, okay, I'll read one from which I call Departure Lounge. Give me a second. Right, so this is Departure Lounge. Um, he had come to, even though I was, a grown woman and adult, he came all the way from shortly before he died. So I write this about that. Departure Lounge. In this one, you are without a cigarette in your hand because it was inside of an airport, artificially chilled, naturally sad. You drove me there in your old van at one of those impossible hours when planes decide to leave. I don't know why I suddenly took this picture of you standing there, slightly sleepy, slightly anxious. Your right hand hangs awkwardly by your side, not knowing what to do with itself. Your left hand is in the pocket of your blue denim jeans. In this one, you are boyish, too youthful to be my dad. Did my camera see what I could not that night? That the rest of your life was 6 months of time, and that you would decide to leave suddenly at an impossible hour. That's
Very poignant. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. There's another aspect of your work which I was very drawn to, and that's the way that you reference gender issues quite a lot,
right.
and they're clearly quite prevalent in your thinking. It's like an underlying theme for you. And in fact, when we were talking earlier in the week, I believe the very first time that I heard you reading was at a British Council event for Women's Day.
Right.
So can you tell us a bit about the themes, the gender themes that come out in your poetry? I mean, there are so many issues that women are still facing, even more so during this difficult time of COVID. But what for you are the really important ones that we should be all aware of and addressing?
I think violence against women and domestic and gender-based violence is probably the most immediate and urgent issue. Um, uh, that and well, the subtle and not so subtle sexual harassment which women undergo. It's not only women, but I would say largely women are victims of. So violence and sexual harassment and the basic everyday sexism of uh, how women need to be play dual roles of breadwinner as well as housewife, and the pressures that women are put under. I write about how women are seen only in their roles of mothers, and all the more subtle, less urgent kind of sexism that we see. But I also write about violence. I write in my second book. There's a poem called Election Night, which is a very personal poem, a poem about how uh, a very close friend of my father's tried to rape me. So that is like a bit of I think that was a bit of a shocking poem for a lot of people who knew me. Yeah, so there's personal experience of gender-based violence, um, like in the whole Me Too movement. I mean, I'm not the only one. So I think those issues need to be addressed very urgently.
Yes, it demands a whole societal change, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
it feels at the moment as if things are actually going backwards during this difficult COVID time, with so many women, have been constrained to households,
The
sometimes abusive
house.
households,
Yeah.
very hard.
Hmm.
So yeah, that was very interesting and quite personal what you said there. Are you able to share that poem with us? Would you read that poem for
Election
us?
night. Election night.
Yeah.
Uh, did you ask for the poem that I wrote about gender-based violence? Is it?
It could be, I mean, any poem that you would prefer to read. Of course, it must be your choice,
Okay.
if you can,
Okay.
if that's all right with you. But that
That's
one,
fine.
because you mentioned it,
Yes. Okay. I'll
very
read.
powerful.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, election night. For months after he tried to force his alcohol drenched tongue into my mouth, my father's friend, lawyer, pillar of society, avoided my accusing eyes as I lurked with clenched fists in bleeding palms behind the curtain at the door entrance to my room, where I stayed reading in a time prison, waiting for university to begin. As the weeks grew into months and more bodies appeared tied to lampposts or burning on roadside tire piles, my shock swelled and hardened into an erect hatred that spawned regrets about not plunging the kitchen knife into the side of this man who had once held me in his hands but a week after I was born. That The Dettol antiseptic burned my lips, and the skin on my 19-year-old breasts grew red with scrubbing as my fingers turned like prunes from too much time in the shower, washing away innocence, guilt, trauma, pain, and memories' dark disgrace. Torn between the desire to report the attempted rape to my father and the fear that perpetrator would become murder victim, I cried silent, hot, angry tears, tried to remember which of my grandmother's Victorian codes I had violated. Was it the straps that held my pink striped cotton dress together at my shoulders, or the naive trust of a parent's beloved friend that had been my undoing?
Yeah, very, very powerful. Thank you so much for reading that. It's not something that one forget, an experience like that.
Yeah.
There's another theme that it goes through quite subtly, I find, in the poems of yours that I've read. And that's race and racism, which you touch on. And of course, this is very much in unconscious thoughts, I think, in society at the moment, since the death of George Floyd.
Right.
And your poetry addresses both this notion of conscious and largely unconscious or bias, really, unconscious racism.
Right.
And you pick them up. That's what's so interesting. And I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about those experiences, where you noticed them, where you found them, and how they found your way in, how they found their way into your poetry.
Right. Okay. So racism I have felt here in Sri Lanka because I have a Belgian surname, VanderPoorten. So uh, because I'm hybrid and mixed. My mother is Sinhalese and my father is one quarter Sinhalese. So I carry my great grandfather's name. So growing up in Kurunegala, which was a very 99% Sinhalese Buddhist society, uh, I encountered racism even in my school. Um, in subtle ways, when I would write my Sinhala essay and it would get the highest mark in class, my teacher would read it out in class and say, "Look at this child. She's writing such a great essay in Sinhalese, but when y'all couldn't, and she's not even Sinhalese, you know, that kind of yeah. So that was very normal, very normalized. Then in I write a poem about a girl in fifth grade who called me a really bad word, um, which means in English, "You outsider," "you outsider," but it has a really bad meaning in Sinhalese. So I encountered that kind of racism, and then when I got married in my first marriage, my then mother-in-law would say my son could have married a Sinhalese girl, but I don't know why he did this and married you, who are burger, because all that. So if anything ever went wrong, it was because of my race. Then when I went abroad to study, I realized that you could be called racist slurs because you're an outsider there too. So I was more sensitized to that, and but all in all, I didn't encounter it a whole lot, but there was some racism in the area we were, because it was soon after the Good Friday Agreement, and I how people there explained it was that there was all this negative energy and it needed an outlet, and then they were targeting racial rather than political or religious conflict. So outside our university there would be swastikas drawn in tar saying go home. So there was that kind of racism, and somebody
In
called me
Northern Ireland?
in Northern Ireland soon after. There would be so the news would be full of reports about how petrol bombs were thrown at even Portuguese families, and so that kind of thing was there. So I encountered a little bit of it there as well. So that's from a very personal point of view. But is well and alive all over the world. Here in Sri Lanka, out there, you know, in almost all countries. So that's why
Race,
I write about.
yeah, be everywhere. You're right. I suppose, if anything, what's happening now is that there's much more awareness of conscious awareness of what happens on people's attitudes, and hopefully,
Yeah.
I think as we go forward, post-COVID situation, there'll be a willingness to address racism. I'd love you to read or choose a poem and read for us one of the poems in which you reflect on this.
Okay. Um, this is one that from like way before Northern Ireland. This happened in the UK, in England actually. I call it Single
Mm-hmm.
Brown Female 1998. And I'm reading it because the racism is quite subtle in this. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, Single Brown Female 1998. Hey, you say, your voice, deep and sweet, is inviting. Hey, why not? You take me to the pub, which is great. I can spend time with you, stretch a half pint of beer over 2 hours, and pretend to like it. Admire the green flecks in your brown eyes and be bewitched by the way you pronounce your words for two more. I can pretend to drink, to like the music, which is too loud, and your stories are spicy, so I can pretend to like the food, which isn't. But when you offer me more than your but when you offer me more than your laughter and your conversation, I cannot accept it, even in this strange, cold place where there is a different and altered me. But I thought you were different, you say, not like conventional Indian girls. I don't even bother to reply that India is not where I'm from. Hey, why not, you ask? Your voice sweet and thick as treacle. Because, I say, because.
Very nice. Thank you. Um, I think we're probably nearly ready to move on to questions, but I have one more question that I'd like to ask you before we look at the questions from our viewers. I would like to ask you about your latest writing. So 3 published books of poetry, and I understand that you've got some poetry that not new poetry that isn't published yet. And I'm hoping that you will be willing to share some of it with us.
Okay. So, what I'm looking forward to publishing next is actually a collection of translated poems. I've been lately translating poems from Sinhala to English, and I think writers have almost have like a duty to try and bridge there is big gaps between communities, and I think Sinhalese and Tamil writing should be translated into English and vice versa. And so I have sort of taken on a task of collecting poems that have been published in Sinhalese in book form, as well as there's a very vibrant community of poets writing in Sinhalese in cyberspace. So on social media. So I'm trying to gather together a collection of translations. So to in response to your question, I can read one poem that I have translated, and I can read one from a new poem written originally in English. Is that okay?
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. So this is a poem I translated when we were at home for a couple of days soon after that horrendous April Easter attacks. And it made me think, and I turned to poetry, as I do in times of darkness. So this is from the very popular, very um, amazing Sinhalese writer that we have, who is also a professor at the University of Peradeniya, Liyanage Amarakirti. So his poem is called Kaviyakata Ida, and I translated it into a poem's plea. So I'll read it out. This is my translation. In that invisible place between time and space, allow me to rest. In that infinitesimal difference between flower and its fragrance, let me linger. In the delicate point between poetry and prose, may I pause. Between air and water, in that vapor like vicinity, allow me to live. In that ephemeral hour between nighttime and daytime, may I tarry. In that gray area between homeland and other land, let me stay. In that minute space between us and them, there allow me to be. At that moment of daybreak, which lies between a poet and his poem, let me linger. This is not mine, but my poem's plea. Um, so that's the
Beautiful.
translated one. And he liked it
Translation.
and said that it was great. So that's why I took the liberty of reading it. Um,
He's pleased with the translation.
sorry?
He's pleased with the translation.
He is,
That's
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm interested. I imagine there are so few poets who can actually make a living from poetry that basically, hear me at all?
I can hear little bits.
Oh, how strange.
Okay, now I can hear you. If you
Oh,
can
that's
repeat.
better.
Yeah.
I'm saying that it's almost impossible for a poet to earn their living through poetry.
Yes,
And they have
definitely.
they have to find gaps in their lives in which they can write poetry. I think it's wonderful that you're translating and other poets and making them more widely available. And it's another talent, isn't it? It's another skill, I guess.
Yeah.
Translation.
Yeah, it requires so much more. It's a very different act of creativity, I think. Yeah.
But nevertheless, a creative act.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd love to hear one of your poems, one of your new poems.
Right. So this one is I saw some months ago, or maybe a year ago, there was this whole talk of bringing back the death penalty to Sri Lanka, and the previous president was very adamant that people should be convicts should be hanged again, and there was this advertisement, vacancy for a hangman, whatever, vacancy for a hangman. So I wrote a poem with that title, vacancy for a hangman. Wanted a hangman. Attributes: moral fortitude, strength of character. Nature of duties: pulling back, pulling black hood over irony, executing convicts accurately, tightening rope around righteous anger. Preference will be given to someone who is: 1. Deaf so he can't hear his heart scream; 2. Able to shut the trapdoor to his conscience; 3. Blind so he cannot see himself become what he kills. It's a very short poem.
I don't think I will ever forget that. That is so. I remember when the advert came out that I'd actually temporarily forgotten it, but that is so powerful. Very, very impactful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to ask Minrali now if we can turn to you. And you've been very kindly watching what questions have been coming through from the audience. And maybe this is a good opportunity for us to turn to those and see what the audience have been thinking and asking. Minrali.
Okay, so Vivi, there's this. It says, amazing to listen to the lived experiences behind your poetry. Amazing that you have also touched on different distressing social aspects. Would you like to, when we talk about social aspects, sometimes I think people wonder why this identity, a Sri Lankan identity, has eluded us. And you are sort of, you interact with students so much. What do you think, you see coming out of that? Why do people see you as Burger and somebody else Sinhalese? Why aren't we Sri Lankan?
It's when there's a struggle for resources, I think there's always a reason to exercise power through difference, right? And have a fear of the other in some way, and that's how also politics works, right? I mean, a lot of people, politicians, they incite people into being more acutely aware of differences between them and of othering other people. So because they can profit from it and profit from fear. I mean, it's the same thing that's happening in the US, right? With Donald Trump saying, all these immigrants are coming to take your jobs. So it's a kind of I think fear and fear seems to be behind a lot of all this. I mean, that sounds a very naive explanation for something so complex, but I think fear has a lot to do with it, and scarce resources.
Okay. And then who is the poet who moves you? Who is your poet? Did you hear me?
Up,
Sorry, I
Minrali.
said
No, I didn't.
who is the poet who moves you? Who is your special poet?
Oh, right. Many actually. So I've got a lot of poets in Sri Lanka, Sinhalese, poets writing in Sinhalese whose poetry I love. There are too many to mention, but Lenage Amarakirti is obviously one, and there is Kalpana Ambrose, and there is Upeksha Imali Karunara, Karnatilaka. So there are lots of women who write whom I really admire. Well, I love the poetry of Sharon Olds, of Kamala Das, as I said, Margaret Atwood. Too many to mention, actually.
Okay.
Too many to yeah.
You spoke about you read your poem Election Night, the poem Election Night, and in it you referenced your grandmother, and you referenced the pink strap. I'm always curious why, when we have experiences like that, it's I sometimes feel that, as you say, the morality is given to us from a very women's perspective. How can women help us through times like this without actually making us feel, you talk about her Victorian models and it's your grandmother you reference. Did you do that unconsciously, or I think a lot of women feel like that.
Minali, I didn't hear a lot of what you said. Could you it was
Oh, I'm
breaking
so
up on
sorry.
keywords.
I think the connection is bad.
Yeah.
Okay, no, you reference your grandmother in your poem Election Night. I was, and I think that we think of a lot about what women will think of us when we have had a negative experience like what you
Yes.
had. So I was
Yes.
wondering how women can help women to better address those situations and
Yeah.
sort of not
Yeah. The
feel
thing is,
so that we are to blame so much.
exactly. So there's a lot of victim blaming. And the first thing that happens when something happens to you is the first thought that runs through your head is, what did I do wrong? What did I do to deserve that? Like, you try to
Yeah,
imagine.
correct.
I mean, I had a very recent experience online too, and I was the default mode is like, what is it that I did that asked for it? Like, what did I do? So that inward, turning inward, is something that it's so ingrained in us. And I don't know, I felt quite amazed that I call myself a feminist, and I still, the instinctive thing was to ask myself, what did I do wrong? So that's what I write in that poem, because I felt that my grandmother, that's my mother's mother, who used to always tell us how to that you should sit properly, a girl should, were you wearing? And I remember that I was wearing this dress with straps. I was 19 years old, you know. So that's what I try to bring out in the poem. Women internalize all these patriarchal norms, right? And then they force it on women who have less power than them. So that's it's like an endless cycle.
And we have another question. It talks about what impact and influence leaving Kurunagala had on you as a poet and how you write your poetry. You know,
What impact and influence had leaving? Uh,
leaving Kurunagala, because that was like your safe place. That's your memory of your
Living.
father and family and
yeah,
growing up. And yes,
I think
yes.
coming to the city, big city, um, kinds of gives you so much more insight in different opinions and different ways of life that opens your mind. And I think I would not have been brave enough to write what I have written if I stayed in Kurunegala. So leaving in that sense was very freeing.
Yeah.
Jill, do we have time for another question, or do you want to pose your last question?
Oh, let's
I
do
know you
one
have.
more, because I can see
Okay,
them coming through. And then if I would like to reserve the last question for me.
Okay, all right. Why did you choose poetry over other kinds of writing? Why was poetry your voice?
Right. Um, I think I don't have the discipline to write a sustained kind of genre like a novel. And I just don't have the discipline to sit at something. And poetry is something. I'm not saying poetry is easier to write, but it matched the way that my creativity comes in, like kind of short bursts, and then I leave it aside and I don't look at it for months. And I hardly think you can be a novelist if you're like that. And I just love poetry.
Okay. Thank you, Vivi.
That's,
That's all the questions
that's
from me. And over to you, Jill.
Thank you, Mrinali. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was very interesting little insight about why poetry. Well, so I really did want to keep the last question for myself. As we know, you very kindly curated a collection of new Sri Lankan poetry for us from many entries that we received, over 100, I believe. And we're going to release this new collection online very soon, in I think it's 2 weeks' time. So I would just like to ask you a little bit about that process. And based on your experience, what do you think of the state of poetry in Sri Lanka today, and what sort of future has it got?
Right. Um, yeah, I was very honored to be given the task of curating that uh, anthology of poetry and to select the poems. It was very interesting because it was a totally blind selection. I had no idea who wrote the poems. And though while reading them, I figured that some might have been written by very young people and some older. So that's the only kind of judgment I could make based on who it was. So it was very interesting. I was amazed by the stories people had to tell, uh, the sort of very passionate expressions of uh, uh, expression of what they thought about society. So there were issues uh, dealt with, from war to poverty to religion to, so like a very large range of topics were covered, and there was a very passionate voice. So I think that there's a lot of passion out there and a lot of creativity. But I would also like to say that we would benefit very much from poetry workshops by maybe established poets outside the country, um, and within the country maybe, and a chance to hone our craft. And I speak about myself as well. I've never really learnt. I don't say that you need to have a creative writing masters or whatever to write creatively, but I think some kind of training would help people to young writers to hone their craft, and to use all this passion and the opinions and all that creativity they have to channel it in a way that uh, gives us really well crafted poetry. So I think that I felt that there's a need when I was doing this, and I enjoyed doing it. It was very, very interesting, and I look forward to the launch of the e-anthology.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to invite all our audiences to join us in the Sunday after next, on the 19th of July, when we will be launching this collection of new poetry written in English, curated by Vivimarie. And I'm sure that you'll enjoy it as much as you've enjoyed today. So thank you very much, Vivi, for your time today. And of course, we will be meeting again very soon, in a couple of weeks. And I would also like to thank our audiences for their interest, and also for some insightful comments, which I can see in the chat, and also the very pertinent questions. Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing some of your quite personal thoughts. And I'd just like to say that I really admire you for the bravery of some of your poetry. And it's been I feel very honoured, and I've learned about you and your poetry, and something about Sri Lanka as well, as part of this session today. Thank you so much. Thank you, Vivi.
Thank you, Gill. Thank you. I'm very honored to have been here, and it was a very, very nice discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone, once again, and good night. Good night.